In this video, you'll learn everything you need to know about one of Marvel's fan favorite mystic mutants, Illyana Rasputin, aka Magik. Magik's early years. Before she became the notable superhero known as Magik, this magical mutant was born as Illyana Nikolaevna Rasputina to a humble family of farmers in the Soviet Union. Specifically, Illyana and her family lived in Siberia at a place called the Ost-Ordensky Collective. She had two brothers, both of whom also happened to have the X gene residing in their veins. There's Pyotr Rasputin, who you probably already know as the legendary X-Men Colossus, and then there was Mikhail, who would later go on to become a cosmonaut and a supervillain in the Marvel Universe. In fact, Illyana was present when Professor X visited their homestead and ultimately recruited their brother to become a part of his mutant super team. Eventually, Illyana's otherwise peaceful life would be turned upside down when the villainous Miss Locke kidnapped and held her hostage in order to get to the X-Men. Being a good big bro, Colossus and the other mutants, under Professor Xavier's command, managed to rescue Illyana and her fellow hostages. From there, Illyana would find herself expatriated to the United States under her brother's advice for fear that the Russian government would use her as a tool should she come back to their motherland. Oh, in case you were wondering how she learned English back then, well, suffice it to say that she didn't take any lessons. Instead, Professor X just poked inside her brain and pretty much gave her the ability to become fluent in English. Eventually, Illyana would find herself kidnapped yet again. This time, the evil sorcerer Belasco captured the young girl and took her to the Limbo dimension, the same place that would one day become Illyana's very own stomping ground. And believe us when we say that Illyana had it rough when she was first in Limbo. For one, she was a 6-year-old trapped in an extremely foreign land. For another, Belasco pretty much had a thing for her, prompting the evil mystic to transmute a part of Illyana's soul into a magical artifact called a bloodstone. To make matters worse, Illyana had to suffer through regular beatings from one of Belasco's servants. On the bright side though, a couple of superheroes named Storm and Cat managed to rescue the little girl after some time. These two heroes happened to be a couple of X-Men from one of Marvel's many alternate universes. From there, Storm acted as a mentor to Illyana, teaching her in the ways of magic. On the other hand, Cat taught the young mutant about good old-fashioned close quarters combat. But her trials didn't end there. Belasco pursued them and eventually managed to take control of Cat and turn her into one of his minions. He also revealed that the reason he was so obsessed with Illyana was because Belasco was aiming to use her soul to create more bloodstones that would ultimately summon the Dark Elder gods of the Marvel Universe. It all came to a head when Illyana and Storm had to confront Belasco and Cat. Illyana would end up taking out Cat, and to make matters worse, the young girl was also forced to end Storm's life with her own hands to prevent Belasco's plans from coming to fruition. Along the way, Illyana was able to unlock her mutant abilities, which is the power to open interdimensional gateways. After that, Illyana was able to escape to her home dimension, but she had an axe to grind. So Illyana used her powers again to go back to Limbo and put a permanent end to Belasco's reign of terror. It was during this time that Illyana was able to first manifest her trademark weapon, the Soulsword, by applying magic to her own life force. She used the same weapon to take out Belasco for good. And when all was said and done, Illyana found out that although it seemed like she had been in Limbo for years, only a few minutes had passed on Earth during her absence. Her stay in Limbo caused her to age rapidly, going from an innocent 6-year-old girl to a world-weary teenager by the time she got back to her homeworld. Magik becomes a new mutant. Illyana would continue to live at Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, where she continued her academics and eventually became a part of the professor's newest team, the New Mutants, where she took on the codename Magik. It was during this time that Illyana discovered that Limbo had a significant effect on her. Mainly, she discovered that although she was able to perform feats of magic and mysticism on Earth, her powers were greatly reduced compared to when she used her abilities inside Limbo. On top of that, we find out that at this point, Illyana's continued use of her magical abilities influenced her own mind, turning her evil the more she employed them. It got so bad that Illyana had to hide this fact from the rest of her New Mutants teammates and the rest of the Xavier School. But she was ultimately found out when Illyana had to rely on her mystical abilities to fight off creatures known as dire wraiths during one of her adventures with the Children of the Atom. Eventually, Belasco would return and attempt to kidnap Illyana again. This time, he sent the same minion who he tasked with torturing Illyana when she first arrived in Limbo, a demon named Sim. Well, Sim Sim was way in over his head when he found out that Illyana had turned into a legitimately powerful sorceress after enduring her time in Limbo. And this time, Illyana was able to defeat Sim and even force him to become her own servant. Magik would eventually become Limbo's sovereign ruler after this. Not only that, but it was also during this era when she discovered that summoning the Soulsword on Earth also granted her a magical armor that would become one of her trademark tools of the trade. In fact, Magik had become so proficient with her mutant powers and sorcery that she even established her very own pet play whenever she and the New Mutants faced threats. Specifically, Magik had the habit of teleporting her targets to Limbo and defeating them there, where her powers are at her fullest. On the other hand, Magik also regularly summoned Limbo's demonic citizens, her very own army, to fight threats on Earth. During this period, Illyana would come face to face with the cosmic threat known as the Beyonder. The Beyonder managed to accost Illyana and release her other evil half called Darkchild. In the end, it would take Kitty Pryde to save Illyana from being completely taken over by Darkchild. To do this, she used Magik's own Soulsword to stab her friend and bring Illyana's true self back to the fold. Sometime later, Magik and the New Mutants would face the Asgardian sorceress Amora, aka the Enchantress. Enchantress would use her powers to separate Illyana from her Darkchild, after which she used Darkchild as one of her minions. But as superhero stories go, Magik and the New Mutants ultimately defeated both Enchantress and Darkchild, with Magik even banishing the Asgardian sorceress to Limbo after that. And not long after, Magik and the New Mutants would find themselves under the tutelage of longtime X-Men rival Magneto. It was during this time that Illyana saw the return of the Beyonder, who proceeded to neutralize her magic-based abilities. The Beyonder then took out Magik's fellow New Mutants, but also used his own powers to bring them back to life as his henchmen. Ultimately, the formidable mutant Rachel Summers would come to Illyana's aid to finally put a stop to the Beyonder. Illyana and the New Mutants then faced off against the interdimensional villain Mojo and defeated the Ugly Blob. Afterwards, Magik would find herself in a bind where the villain Magnus attacked her and her team. To fight Magnus, Magik used her mutant powers to transport them and their enemy to Limbo. There, Magnus would team up with Illyana's treacherous demon minion Sim and attempt a coup. In response, Illyana tried to destroy all of Limbo with her Soulsword, but it didn't necessarily work like a charm. Magik had to return to Limbo after that to get back the Soulsword and finally defeat Sim and Magnus. It was a bit of a costly fight too, as Magik allowed her Darkchild persona to take over in order to take out her enemies. This made her realize that she would be better off staying in Limbo than returning to Earth. This particular chapter in Illyana's life came to a head when she and Professor X had a falling out when the old man pretty much forced her to return to Earth with the help of another mutant named Karma. This angered Illyana enough for her to decide to leave the New Mutants for good. Now, Magik would fall into a spiral after this. She learned that her brother, Colossus, and her best friend, Kitty Pryde, had fallen in battle against the group known as the Marauders. This made Illyana succumb to Darkchild's influence. However, Magneto managed to give Illyana a much-deserved pep talk to keep her from giving in to her dark side. From there, Illyana would experience a tug-of-war between her own self and Darkchild, vying for control of her entire being. She'd have several episodes where she found herself fighting against her fellow mutants at the Academy, such as the time she battled her old New Mutants teammates, or when she transformed into Darkchild to assault Magneto. There was even one time when she tried to resurrect Colossus with the help of necromancy. It worked in a way, but Magik's whole takeaway from this particularly complicated chapter of her life was that she's got to make sure that Darkchild never overpowers her again. The death and return of Magik. We find out that Magik's old sniveling minion Sim was making moves in Limbo while all the drama was happening in her life back on Earth. Sim eventually grew strong enough to steal Magik's Soulsword from her, not to mention that he sought the aid of another evil sorcerer named Nasturth to force Illyana to transform into Darkchild. This all climaxed when Nasturth tried to take over Earth by opening up a portal that links it to Limbo, but ultimately Illyana was able to get a grip on her Darkchild persona and, well, save the world. More importantly, this whole encounter left a lasting impact on Magik as she started to fully embrace her role as a true ruler of Limbo after this adventure. A whole convoluted plot that ultimately saw Illyana pretty much getting a soft reboot. That is to say, a whole debacle between Magik's friend and fellow New Mutant teammate Wolfsbane and Darkchild ultimately led to Illyana reverting into a previous version of herself, the one from before she learned English and stayed at Xavier's school for gifted youngsters. A villain named Soul Skinner would soon soon discover this, and Soul Skinner then took out Magik's parents and sought her out to use Magik's abilities for his own plans. But the X-Men managed to stop Soul Skinner. Not long after that, Marvel straight up took Magik off the board when they introduced the fictional disease called the Legacy Virus. Illyana succumbed to the Legacy Virus, which then caused her brother Colossus to break bad and join Magneto's crew. Marvel then soon retconned this when it was revealed that the person responsible for Illyana's death was none other than the older brother from the same mother, Mikhail. You'd see Mikhail had the Legacy Virus in him, so he transferred it to Illyana thinking that she'd form an immunity to it. Well, she didn't, and bit the dust. But this is not where Magik's story ends. Soon after these revelations, we find out that Belasco had returned and was now salivating over the idea that he could finally recapture Illyana's soul. With the help of his Bloodstone, which we've mentioned contains a small part of Illyana's soul, Belasco was able to resurrect her. Or more specifically, Belasco brought Darkchild back to life. To make matters even more complicated, this version of Illyana didn't have a soul. Belasco ultimately decided to exile her after finding out about this, and Darkchild would go on to basically try and become whole again. This all culminated in a face-off against Witchfire, Belasco's equally evil daughter, who also happens to be a sorceress. In the end, Darkchild proved herself to be not such a bad girl after defeating Witchfire and to an extent reclaiming her identity as Illyana. Afterwards, the rest of her mutant cohorts invited this new, soulless version of Magik to rejoin the X-Team. Magik returns to the New Mutants. Illyana then proceeded to find a way to regain her soul by traveling through time and space. She would meet Professor X's son, the powerful yet unstable mutant Legion, and struck up a deal with him. In exchange for helping Legion return to Earth, Legion would help Magik defeat the Elder Gods, which would then help her get her soul back. Time travel and telepathic shenanigans ensued, where Legion eventually found himself in an unsurprisingly mental, unstable state. In the end, Magik entered Legion's mind to help him with all his issues, but still, Illyana didn't have a soul. Time would pass, and we next see Magik as a prominent member of the then newfound mutant nation called Utopia, where she pretty much served as one of its guardians. In this capacity, Magik battled with the likes of supervillain Selene and the mutant-hating Purifiers. Regardless of her efforts to prove that she'd be keeping her Darkchild persona in check, even without a soul, some of mutant kind still had a lingering distrust of Illyana. But there was no time to mope about it. That's because Magik soon got thrown into the fray yet again when she discovered that the shady government organization called Project Purgatory managed to set up shop in Limbo. So she and the rest of the New Mutants headed over to Limbo to try and stop these agents. However, they were soon overpowered, and what's worse, Project Purgatory was able to steal Illyana's Soulsword from her, along with another magical artifact called a Soul Dagger from another X-Team member, Pixie. It was then revealed that Project Purgatory was planning on using these magical artifacts to summon the Elder Gods. Magik gets her soul back. Now, Project Purgatory eventually became successful in summoning the Elder Gods. Things look dire for our heroes at this point, but remember Legion? Yeah, he might be a mentally unstable Omega level threat most of the time, but our guy knows how to keep an oath. Before the Elder Gods could wreak havoc on all of existence, Legion arrived on the scene and took out the Eldritch monsters. And he did it in a definitive fashion too, as Legion straight up altered reality to erase any and all traces of them from existence. In addition to that, this reality warping power also managed to fuse Illyana with her soul, finally making her whole again. We then find out that Magik wasn't as heroic as she seemed to be, as she revealed that everything had happened right from when Belasco resurrected her up until this point was all part of her plan to restore her soul. Upon finding this out, the X-Men's leader Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, arrested Illyana and equipped her with an explosive vest designed to blow up if she tried using any of her powers. Still, Magik said it was all fair play. She might be shady, but she knew she deserved the punishment, so she did her time. And it wasn't like she got life imprisonment, because not long after being sentenced, Cyclops crawled back to Illyana and pretty much begged her to help the rest of mutantdom to put a stop to Asgardian god of fear, Kurth, who had possessed Cain Marko, aka the Juggernaut. To do that, Illyana used her powers to travel to the Crimson Cosmos to meet Sidorak, the god of destruction, who also happens to be the same being who gave Cain Marko his powers as the Juggernaut. In a nutshell, Illyana snitched on Cain and told Cyttorak that he left him for Kurth. This enraged Cyttorak, so he decided to remove all of Cain Marko's Juggernaut privileges and grant it to Magik instead. Before she could receive Cyttorak's blessing, though, Piotr went full Big Brother mode and took Illyana's place as the new Juggernaut instead. Now you should know that Cyclops and Wolverine had a bit of a lover's spat after this, which then caused mutant kind to fracture into two camps: Cyclops' so-called Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters and Wolverine's own Jean Grey School for Higher Learning. Magik chose to stay in Cyclops' camp even though they had their differences, and that's because she wanted to keep an eye on her brother in case his newfound Juggernaut powers flared up and wrecked everything. Illyana becomes a god. A bit of time would pass and Magik and the rest of Cyclops' team would find themselves at odds with Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers. You see, the Avengers took it upon themselves to hunt down the young mutant of prophecy named Hope Summers, so they took over Utopia. Magik would prove to be invaluable during this confrontation, as she was the one responsible for being the team's personal transport, thanks to her mutant ability to open up portals. She would then transport her team to the moon, where they caught wind that Hope Summers was there. But they ended up confronting the Avengers again upon reaching it. Not only that, but the Phoenix Force was also pursuing Hope during this adventure, which was the main reason why the Avengers were so dead set on capturing her. During their battle with the Avengers on the moon, Iron Man inadvertently fractured the Phoenix Force, causing it to split into 5 pieces. These 5 Phoenix Force pieces then possessed Magik, Cyclops, Colossus, Emma Frost, and Namor, who then formed a super team called the Phoenix Force 5. We would bear witness to the extent of the Phoenix Force's influence within Illyana when she urged her brother Colossus to take Spider-Man's life during one of their fights. Thankfully, Colossus was more level-headed than his sister, so instead of taking out Spidey, Colossus tussled with Illyana and they ended up literally knocking out the Phoenix Force out of each other. At this point, we're about to have some good old-fashioned family drama. You see, Magik originally intended for Colossus to take her place as the new Juggernaut, because in some messed up way that only Illyana herself could understand, she believed that hoodwinking her brother into becoming Cyttorak's slave would make Colossus realize that she's a bad girl who's unworthy of his love. Well, it worked. It worked too well because Colossus went on Cyttorak-powered rampage when he learned this from Illyana. Eventually, Illyana helped Colossus break free of Cyttorak's control by taking him to Limbo and using the Soulsword to break his bond with the God of Destruction. But this left a bitter taste in his mouth. The damage has been done, and he swore he was going to take out Illyana the next time they saw each other. Afterwards, Magik would help Cyclops escape from jail after the rest of Marvel's superheroes arrested him for basically trying to destroy the world using the Phoenix Force. And from there, Magik pretty much became a full-on vigilante. Magik would then discover that her powers had become augmented after her recent interaction with the Phoenix Force and Scarlet Witch's magic, which she used to bring the rest of mutant kind back to existence in a completely different storyline. In any case, Magik discovered that she now had the ability to channel Limbo's energies directly. There was one huge problem though: she didn't know how to control it. A whole debacle ensued where she accidentally transported herself and the rest of her team to Limbo, where they had to fight Dormammu. Illyana defeated Dormammu, but she realized she needed help with her powers, so she sought the help of Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange proved to be an effective mentor, and she ended up keeping her powers in check. Sometime later, Magik pulled away from the Cyclops mutant vigilante group and joined Wolverine at the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning. Plus, she and Colossus reconciled with each other, so everything seemed to work out, for a time at least. Crisis and New Nations. Magik would go on to play supporting roles during the Terrigen Mist crisis that briefly gripped Earth 616, where she faced off against the Inhumans along with her mutant allies. She would also take on an apprentice named Sapna, but Magik would end up putting Sapna down when she got possessed by a cosmic threat called the World Eater. On a brighter note, Magik even helped X-Factor member Strong Guy get his soul back somewhere along the way. Magik returned to the spotlight during the House of X storyline when mutant kind found a new nation called Krakoa, which also happened to be a sentient mutant island. During this chapter in her life, Illyana became one of Krakoa's captains. During her tenure, Magik found herself participating in a gladiatorial contest called the Ten of Swords Tournament. She'd also become a mentor of young mutants of this island nation, and more notably, Magik would also join the Marauders during this period. That's not where the adventures end for Illyana either, as our girl proved that she was a legit multitasker. Aside from everything we mentioned, Magik went on missions with her old team, the New Mutants. During one of their exploits, she and her team went to space to go look for their old friend Cannonball. This opened up a whole interstellar adventure where Illyana found herself allying with Shi'ar, specifically the warrior princess Deathbird. They then proceeded in helping the rest of mutant kind find safe passage to Krakoa. Not only that, but Magik even got herself a side gig becoming an instructor at Strange Academy. At this point, Illyana finally realized that she'd been stretched too thin because remember, Magik was spinning a lot of plates. On one hand, she was one of Krakoa's captains, then she was also a member of New Mutants, and not to mention she also had a gig teaching at Strange Academy. Oh, and let's not forget, she was also a literal queen back in Limbo. In light of all this, Magik came to the conclusion of streamlining her time and attention, so she decided to drop one of her many roles. In particular, she chose to relinquish her throne in Limbo and hand it over to someone else. Magik saw that there was one person in the world who was capable of filling her role as Limbo's sovereign, former villainous and Jean Grey clone, Madeline Pryor, aka the Goblin Queen. So Magik put her plan into action and proceeded to hand over her rule of Limbo to Madeline by traveling to the dimension along with fellow New Mutants Wolfsbane and Danny Moonstar as witness. But a wrench is thrown in her plan when they discover that Sim is back at it with his sniveling ways as the demon tried for the umpteenth time to take control of the dimension. Magik, Madeline, Wolfsbane, and Danny would then fight Sim and his loyalists. As always, they end up putting Sim in his place, and after that, Magik would finally be able to hand over control of Limbo to Madeline, freeing her of the responsibilities to the realm.